You know those family stories where everyone pretends everything's fine, but deep down, the resentment festers like an old wound that never quite heals. Well, mine started with my parents slipping thousands under the table to my sister, propping up her picture-perfect life while I watched my own world crumble, and it all boiled over at a backyard barbecue when I finally called them out right there in front of the potato salad and forced smiles, turning the whole gathering into a battlefield none of us saw coming. I remember the day I first noticed how lopsided things really were in our family, back when Maria and I were still kids scraping by in that cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the L train rattled our windows every 15 minutes and dreams felt like luxuries we couldn't afford. My parents, Frank and Linda Ramirez, were the salt-of-the-earth types, Dad fixing cars at the local garage, Mom clerking at the corner store, always preaching about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but somehow that lesson never applied evenly, especially when it came to their two daughters. Maria, the older one by 3 years, had this effortless charm, the kind that made teachers smile and boys linger, and without a word, our folks started funneling little extras her way: a new dress for prom here, tutoring sessions there, while I got the hand-me-downs and a pat on the back for good grades that barely paid the bills later on. It wasn't until I was 28, fresh off a messy divorce from my ex who skipped town with more than his share of our savings, that the real gap showed up, like a crack in the foundation of the old family home. I was drowning in rent for a one-bedroom in Cicero, working double shifts at the diner to keep the lights on, and Maria? She was house hunting in the suburbs, talking about starter homes with white picket fences, the kind of dream that evaporates when your credit score's in the toilet. I swallowed my pride and asked Mom and Dad for a loan, just $5,000 to bridge the gap until my next paycheck, and they hemmed and hawed about tough times at the garage, how they were stretched thin with their own mortgage. Fair enough, I thought. We're all in the same boat. But then, a couple months later, I overheard Dad on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low and gruff, mentioning wiring money for Maria's down payment, thousands of it. All hush-hush, like it was some noble secret they were keeping from the tax man or something equally shady. It hit me then, this quiet favoritism that had been brewing since we were little, how Maria's life got the grease while mine ran on fumes. And I bit my tongue because that's what you do in families like ours. You nod and smile through the bitterness, hoping it'll even out someday. Fast forward 2 years, and life threw me a curveball that made everything blur into urgency. I found out I was pregnant with Tommy, my little boy who arrived screaming into the world on a rainy autumn night at the county hospital, his tiny fists waving like he was already fighting for his place. Those early months were magic mixed with exhaustion, Tommy's gummy smiles lighting up our tiny apartment, me juggling night feeds with dawn shifts, feeling like maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start I needed after the divorce dust settled. But even then, the family scales tipped. Maria breezed in with baby gifts and coups, while Mom and Dad sent a card with a $20 bill tucked inside, as if that covered the diapers stacking up in the corner. Tommy was a healthy kid at first, chubby cheeks and endless curiosity, toddling around chasing the neighborhood cats, but around his 2nd birthday, I started noticing the cough, a dry, persistent hack that lingered after colds, nothing major at the time, but enough to make me watch him a little closer during those long nights when sleep evaded me. I mentioned it casually at the next family Easter brunch, the one where Aunt Rosa's deviled eggs steal the show every year, and Dad waved it off with a chuckle, saying boys will be boys, and to save my worry for real problems, Maria, meanwhile, was glowing about her promotion at the bank, and sure enough, later that spring, I caught wind through the grapevine, our cousin's loose lips at the grocery, that Mom and Dad had quietly co-signed a loan for her new car, another chunk of change that made my beat-up sedan feel like a cruel joke. It stung, but I pushed it down, focusing on Tommy's little victories, like his first words bubbling out as "Mama," while we played in the park near the expressway, the city hum a constant backdrop to our simple joys. Still, that cough hung around, turning into something that had me Googling symptoms on my cracked phone screen during breaks, my heart twisting with that mom gut feeling you can't ignore. One evening, after tucking Tommy in early because he was wiped out from a play date, I rummaged through an old box of family papers Mom had dropped off. Months back, bills and receipts mostly, the kind of junk you inherit when parents downsize, and there it was, tucked between utility statements, a bank confirmation for a transfer of $12,000 to Maria's account. Dated right around the time I'd been scraping pennies for formula. My hands shook as I stared at it, the numbers blurring under the kitchen light, realizing this wasn't just favoritism, it was a deliberate secret. One that made my pleas for help feel like echoes in an empty room. And just then, from the bedroom, Tommy's cough erupted again, sharper this time, pulling me back to the present with a jolt that left me wondering how much deeper this rabbit hole went, especially as his little body seemed to fight harder with every breath. The whole mess stinking of betrayal worse than week-old takeout left on the counter, and in that moment, I knew the uneven scales of our family were tipping towards something I couldn't ignore anymore, something that would demand a reckoning sooner than any of them imagined. Holding that bank slip in my hand felt like gripping a live wire, the kind that buzzes through your veins and makes you question every hug and holiday toast from the folks who raised you, but life doesn't pause for revelations. So I folded it away and doubled down on being the rock for Tommy, scheduling that doctor's appointment I'd been putting off because co-pays were a monthly nightmare. The pediatrician, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel with a clipboard full of charts, listened to Tommy's chest and frowned, ordering tests that sounded like a foreign language, echocardiograms, blood work, the works, and by the time we got the results a week later, my world tilted on its axis. Tommy had a congenital heart defect, something rare called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where the muscle thickens and squeezes the flow, treatable with surgery, but clocking in at over $100,000 even with insurance haggling. I sat in that sterile waiting room, Tommy coloring on the floor with crayons that smudged his fingers blue, and called my parents right there, my voice cracking as I laid it out, the diagnosis, the urgency, the money we didn't have for the specialist downstate, and Dad's response was a heavy sigh followed by, "We're not made of money." Elena, Maria's got her own troubles with the house payments, as if my son's heartbeat was just another bill to balance against their priorities. It crushed me, that casual denial, especially knowing about the secret funds they'd funneled her way, but I didn't let on, just thanked them through gritted teeth and hung up, turning instead to food banks and overtime shifts that left me hollow-eyed and snapping at customers over hash brown orders. Flashbacks to our upbringing flooded in during those long nights, like how Maria got the full-ride scholarship push while I pieced together community college with waitressing tips, or the time Dad loaned her $500 for a wedding dress, but made me pay back every cent of the $20 I borrowed for school supplies. Ironic, really, how their tough love always softened for the favored one. Desperation bred a spark of mischief in me, the kind that sneaks up when you're backed into a corner. So I decided on a little payback that wouldn't raise alarms, logging into an anonymous community forum for Maria's upscale neighborhood, posting a vague tip about lucky inheritances funding dream homes, with just enough detail to get the Busybody Homeowners Association buzzing, and sure enough, within days, she called me fuming about nosy questions at the mailbox, her voice pitching high like a tea kettle on boil. I played dumb, offering sympathy with a straight face over the phone, but inside, a wry grin formed because for once, her perfect facade had a smudge, a tiny crack that mirrored the one widening in my own life as Tommy's energy flagged, his playtime shortening to naps on the couch while I paced the apartment, fielding calls from the hospital about pre-op requirements we couldn't meet, the conflict gnawed at me, that push-pull between blasting the truth wide open and keeping the peace for Tommy's sake. But family loyalty's a tricky beast, especially when it's one-sided. Weeks blurred into a haze of specialist visits and denial letters from the insurance folks, each one a punch to the gut, and I started noticing how Mom's calls to me grew shorter, more clipped. While her Facebook lit up with likes on Maria's vacation pics from the lake house, another gift, I suspected, though I had no proof yet, one afternoon, after a particularly brutal round of tests where Tommy cried through the wires and gels, I swung by my parents' place unannounced, the old bungalow, smelling of Dad's motor oil and Mom's percolating coffee, hoping to try again in person. They were in the kitchen, Dad nursing a beer, Mom stirring soup, and as I spilled the latest, how the surgery window was closing without funds, their excuses piled up like dirty dishes. Retirement. Savings too thin. Maria's family counting on them for babysitting duties now that she had kids of her own. Maria's family, two towhead rugrats with trust funds in the making, while mine hung by a thread, and that's when Dad let slip something careless, praising how stable Maria's life was these days, thanks to that help we gave her last year, his words landing like a slap before he caught himself and changed the subject to the Cubs' lousy season. I drove home in a fury, Tommy dozing in his car seat, my mind racing with questions about just how deep their secrets ran, and that night, as his cough echoed through the thin walls again, more ragged than before, I pulled out my laptop and started digging. Old emails, shared family drives, anything to connect the dots, uncovering a trail that led straight to a locked folder on Dad's computer from a visit months back, one click away from spilling it all, but my hands froze, heart pounding. Because what happens when you unearth the truth and there's no going back, especially with your boy's life hanging in the balance, the whole situation reeking of a setup more twisted than a bad plot in one of those late-night cop shows, leaving me teetering on the edge of a decision that could crack the family wide open or bury me under the fallout. Peeking into that forbidden folder felt like crossing into enemy territory, the glow of the screen casting shadows on the walls of my dimly lit living room while Tommy slept fitfully down the hall, his breathing a labored rhythm that synced with the dread building in my chest. But what I found there, scanned checks, wire transfer receipts, all earmarked for Maria's fresh start, confirmed the worst without a shred of doubt, painting a picture of parents who played favorites not out of necessity, but choice, doling out $12,000 here for her house, $8,000 there for her business venture, all while my calls for help echoed unanswered, and tucked among them was an email chain where Mom had written to Dad about toughening Elena up by denying her the same lifeline, as if my struggles were some character-building exercise they scripted from afar. Armed with printouts tucked in my purse like contraband, I pushed through the next few months in a survival fog, shuttling Tommy to clinics where doctors murmured about time-sensitive interventions, the kind that could rewrite his future if only the funds materialized. But every fundraiser I scraped together, online pleas to old friends, selling off my wedding rings, fell short, leaving me to haggle with social workers who offered waitlists longer than the line at Costco on Black Friday, the frustration mounting like steam in a pressure cooker nobody bothered to vent. The family rift widened subtly, like a fault line shifting underfoot. Maria stopped by once with store-bought lasagna, her eyes darting away when I mentioned the mounting bills, and later I pieced it together from a stray text she sent by mistake, admitting to Mom that she felt bad, but Elena's always been the strong one, as if resilience excused abandonment, twisting the knife deeper because she knew she had to know about the helping hand she'd grasped while mine flailed in the dark, her casual complicity turning what I thought was ignorance into something more calculated, more hurtful in its everyday normalcy. A twist came unexpectedly during a rare family cookout at the park, the one where Uncle Joe's ribs draw a crowd every summer. My brother Carlos, the quiet middle child who'd always hovered on the edges, pulled me aside by the picnic tables, his face etched with that same Ramirez worry lines, and confessed he'd overheard Dad bragging about the loans to Maria years back, even tried to nudge them toward helping me but got shut down with talk of not spoiling the other one. It threw me Carlos as an unwitting ally or just another layer of complicity, forcing a dilemma that kept me up nights, wondering if dragging him in would fracture us further or finally tip the scales, his hesitant offer to talk to them again hanging in the air like unspoken regret amid the sizzle of burgers and laughter from distant relatives. Desperation fueled a sharper edge to my humor, the kind that bites back, at that same cookout when Dad launched into his usual lecture on self-reliance over the grill smoke. I couldn't resist piping up with a dry quip about how some folks must have invisible bootstraps made of gold, earning a few chuckles from cousins, but a glare from him that said I'd crossed a line. And later, as revenge for that email chain I'd uncovered, I took it a step further by anonymously mailing Dad a framed copy of one of his own tough love quotes clipped from an old family newsletter, paired with a photo of Tommy's latest hospital bracelet. No note attached, but the message clear enough to make him squirm at his workbench. A clever jab that satisfied the itch for payback without igniting the full blaze just yet. Still, it felt good, that tiny jab, a precursor to the real payback. I plotted in whispers to myself while folding Tommy's laundry, imagining ways to make them taste the unfairness without torching every bridge, but reality crashed harder than any scheme. Tommy's episodes ramped up, blue lips stirring. Playtime sending us to the ER twice in 1 month, where nurses hooked him to monitors that beeped like accusations, and in the sterile hush of those rooms, I fired off one last desperate plea to my parents via voicemail, detailing the surgeon's warning that without the procedure soon, his heart might not hold. Their response? A joint email from Mom, all platitudes about prayers and strength, no check attached, and that's when the anger solidified into something unbreakable, a resolve that carried us into the operating room gamble they wouldn't fund. A last-ditch experimental trial through a charity program that bought time but no guarantees, the doctor's hopeful nods clashing with the undercurrent of risk that made every visit feel like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The days blurred into a nightmare vigil, me by his bedside reading picture books about brave little engines while machines whirred, and Carlos visited quietly, slipping me a couple hundred from his own pocket with a mumbled "don't tell them," his gesture a flickering light in the gloom, but also a reminder of how fractured we'd all become, his eyes avoiding mine as if sharing the burden made him complicit too, deepening the uncertainty of where loyalties truly lay in this tangled web. Then came the night that shattered everything. Alarms blaring at 3 in the morning, doctors rushing in with grave faces, Tommy's small hand going limp in mine as they fought to stabilize him. But it wasn't enough. The defect won, claiming my boy at just 4 years old, leaving the room echoing with my sobs and the scent of antiseptic that clung to my clothes for weeks, the finality hitting like a freight train through the empty streets of my grief, where every corner of the apartment screamed. His absence, from the echo of his laughter to the silence that swallowed it whole. In the funeral parlor haze, surrounded by wilting lilies and sympathetic nods from neighbors who'd heard whispers of our struggles, I stood, dry-eyed through the service, the grief too vast for tears, vowing in that silent moment amid the organ music a revenge as measured as their betrayals, clever, not cruel, but enough to make them see the cost of their choices. The whole ordeal stinking of injustice more pungent than a backed-up sewer line after a storm, and as the dirt settled on his grave under the oak trees of that West Side cemetery, I drove away with a plan simmering. Subtle clues I'd drop along the way to build the tension. Because the real eruption was coming, at the next family gathering no less, and they had no idea the storm I'd bottled up for so long, leaving me to wonder if unleashing it would free me or just echo back emptier. The shadows of loss lengthening with every mile as I gripped the wheel tighter, the road ahead twisting toward confrontation. Waking up to a world without Tommy's laughter echoing off the apartment walls felt like emerging from a bad dream only to find the nightmare stitched into your skin. Every corner a reminder of the little sneakers by the door or the half-finished puzzles on the coffee table, but grief has a way of sharpening your edges, turning sorrow into a quiet fury that propelled me through the paperwork avalanche, insurance denials, burial costs, the endless forms that mocked my empty bank account, while I rebuilt my days with a job switch to nights at a call center, the monotony a numb shield against the ache that clawed at me during quiet shifts when the phones went silent and memories flooded in unbidden. In those stolen hours of daylight, I dove deeper into the digital breadcrumbs of my family's finances, hacking together access from shared passwords and old emails, unearthing not just the loans to Maria, but a pattern of quiet reallocations. Diverting from Dad's garage profits, Mom's side savings, that painted them as reluctant philanthropists to one child and stern judges to another, including a forged letter I'd spotted in the files, dated around my plea time, claiming financial hardship to the hospital on our behalf without my knowledge, effectively slamming the funding door they'd already half-closed. The deception so layered it made my stomach turn like I'd swallowed bad diner coffee on an empty gut. The discovery burned, that active sabotage disguised as caution, but it also armed me with ammo, printouts and screenshots stacked like evidence in a shoebox under my bed, waiting for the right moment to deploy, each piece a puzzle confirming how their tough love for me was laced with something darker, perhaps resentment from my divorce or just plain old favoritism grown toxic over decades of unspoken preferences. Maria reached out sporadically, texts laced with "I'm so sorry" that rang hollow when I recalled her silence during those desperate calls, and one afternoon she showed up uninvited with coffee and condolences, her eyes red-rimmed, but her designer purse a glaring reminder of the leg up she'd gotten. We sat on my sagging couch, the conversation skirting the edges of truth until she let slip a twist. I'd assumed she was oblivious, but no, she'd known about the money transfers and even thanked Mom privately, rationalizing it as parents helping where it's needed most, her words landing like a confession wrapped in justification, complicating my rage because now she wasn't just complicit, she was invested, her pregnancy announcement a few months back adding this new layer of fragility that made me question if her guilt was genuine or just another shield to deflect the blame she shared in Tommy's loss. It forced a dilemma sharper than any before: confront her alone and risk her spinning tales to the folks, or hold back and let the pot simmer toward the family boil I had brewing, while Carlos texted more often, hinting at his own guilt and offering to back me up, his loyalty a wild card that made me question if blood could ever run thicker than favoritism, especially after he admitted during a late-night call that he'd seen the forged letter once, but stayed quiet to avoid the family fireworks, his hesitation mirroring my own internal tug-of-war between unity and reckoning. Humor crept in as a survival trick, my inner monologue cracking wise during solitary drives along Lake Shore, mocking how Mom's tough love budget must have had a Maria-only line item, the sarcasm a balm against the bitterness that threatened to swallow me whole. Like imagining Dad's garage as a secret vault for sibling subsidies while I scraped by on tips and tenacity, the irony so thick it almost made me chuckle through the tears that still ambushed me at odd hours. The real revenge unfurled cleverly at Thanksgiving, that obligatory gathering in their backyard strung with lights and laden with turkey that always tasted of obligation. I'd brought a photo album as a gift, innocuous on the surface with snaps of holidays past, but I'd slipped in inserts, carefully cropped images of Tommy's hospital bracelets next to blank checks for Maria's house. No accusations outright, but the juxtaposition screaming volumes, and watched as Mom flipped through, her face paling at the silent indictment, Dad grumbling about sentimental nonsense, while Maria fidgeted with her napkin, the air thickening like gravy gone lumpy, a few ants exchanging puzzled glances that hinted at the ripples I'd started without a single word spoken aloud. It was satisfying, that witty prod without a full explosion, a taste of the chaos to come, but it also ramped the uncertainty, their forced smiles hiding whatever countermeasures they plotted. Like Mom's sudden pivot to talking about holiday recipes as if the album had never existed, leaving me to drive home with a hollow victory buzzing in my veins, the simmering pot bubbling just below the surface. Months ticked by. In this tense truce, me navigating holidays with nods and small talk, dropping subtle clues like casual mentions of old bank statements that made Dad's fork pause mid-bite during Christmas dinner, building the anticipation like a slow cooker on low. All while I therapy shopped free sessions at the community center, wrestling with the audience in my head, folks like me, midlife warriors who'd nod along but whisper if my path to payback veered too vengeful, their imagined judgments pushing me to keep the revenge clever rather than corrosive. Then the invitation arrived, a printed card for the annual summer barbecue at their place, the one where the whole clan shows cousins, aunts, the extended Ramirez circus, and as I stared at it over my morning cereal, the plan crystallized. I'd go. armed to the teeth with proof, ready to shatter the facade in front of everyone. But a last-minute twist from Carlos, a hushed call warning that Maria was pregnant again, family expanding as if that erased the past, and that Dad had been hinting at some big family news of his own, left me reeling, pondering if this bombshell would heal fractures or just splinter them wider, the simmering pot on the verge of overflow as the date loomed, pulling me toward a confrontation that promised eruption but hid the true fallout in shadows, the whole setup feeling more precarious than a Jenga tower built on shifting sands, with every block I added threatening to topple the fragile balance I'd maintained for so long. Staring at that barbecue invitation felt like holding a match to dry tinder, the kind of spark that could light up the truth or burn the whole family tree to ash. But with the date circled on my calendar and Tommy's memory fueling every step, I spent the weeks prepping not with pitchforks, but precision, compiling a dossier of emails, bank logs, even a timeline scrawled on notebook paper that laid bare the 12 years of favoritism, from Maria's first loan at 22 to the forged letter that torpedoed my aid request, all wrapped in an innocuous binder labeled Family History, to disarm them until the strike, each page annotated with dates and quotes pulled straight from their own words, turning their secrets into a narrative they couldn't deny without looking like the villains in their own story. The drive to their bungalow that sunny Saturday hummed with nerves, the air thick with grill smoke from neighbors, and the distant lake breeze carrying hints of change, but inside my chest, uncertainty churned. Would this clever unmasking satisfy the hole Tommy left, or just widen it, mixed with a wry anticipation of the looks on their faces when the pot finally boiled over? The radio droning some oldies tune about family ties that only amplified the irony of my solo mission into the fray. Pulling up to the driveway lined with cars, the backyard already buzzing with aunts chatting over coolers and kids chasing frisbees, I gripped the binder like a shield, exchanging hugs that felt scripted, Mom's quick squeeze laced with forced warmth that didn't reach her eyes, Dad's grunt of, "Good to see you," not quite meeting mine as he flipped burgers with more focus than necessary, Maria waddling in her third trimester glow, her hand on her belly as if it bought absolution while her husband hovered protectively, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling like eddies in the nearby canal. Carlos shot me a nod from the picnic table, his silent alliance a comfort amid the growing tension, but even he looked uneasy, whispering as I passed that Dad had been off all week, muttering about old mistakes, a hint that the big family news Carlos mentioned might complicate my timing more than I'd bargained for, planting seeds of doubt about whether my carefully laid plan would land as intended or fizzle in the face of unexpected revelations. The meal unfolded in deceptive normalcy, plates piled with burgers and coleslaw, laughter rippling as Uncle Joe recounted his fishing flop from last month, complete with exaggerated gestures that had the cousins howling, but I felt the undercurrent. Subtle clues I'd dropped earlier, like asking Maria pointedly about her lucky breaks over the potato salad, watching her cheeks flush as she mumbled something about hard work, stirring uneasy glances across the table, the conflict simmering beneath. Small talk about gas prices and grandkids, with Mom steering conversations toward neutral ground like the upcoming county fair, as if sensing the storm clouds gathering. Then, as dessert trays circled with Mom's famous apple pie still warm from the oven, slices dripping with cinnamon-scented filling that masked the bitterness in the air, I made my move. Standing at the head of the long folding table strung under the oaks whose leaves rustled like whispers of encouragement, the binder thumping down like a gavel on the checkered cloth, and in a voice steady as the L trains rumble through the city nights, I laid it out. No yelling, just facts cascading like dominoes. The thousands wired to Maria's accounts while my rent checks bounced during the divorce years, the deliberate denial of help for Tommy's surgery backed by those damning emails where they debated toughening me up, the forged documents that sealed his fate by misleading the hospital into thinking we had no support network, each revelation punctuated by flipped pages that showed dates, amounts, their own signatures staring back accusingly. The evidence so airtight it turned the casual chatter into stunned silence broken only by the sizzle of forgotten sausages on the grill. The table erupted in waves, Gasps from cousins who leaned in with wide eyes, Mom's fork clattering to her plate as her hand flew to her mouth, Dad's face reddening like overcooked meat as he stammered defenses about private matters and tough choices for the greater good. Maria bursting into tears with a twist that blindsided everyone, confessing through sobs that she'd begged them to help me too, but been overruled with promises that Elena would figure it out like, always, her pregnancy, Fragile shield cracking under the weight as she clutched her husband's arm, revealing she'd harbored guilt that festered into her own quiet resentment toward our parents' manipulations. Carlos jumped in, backing my claims with his overheard snippets from years back, turning the gathering into a cacophony of raised voices and spilled iced tea that soaked the tablecloth like blood from an invisible wound, aunts murmuring in shock while Uncle Joe tried to mediate with his booming voice calling for calm. But the damage was done. The facade shattered into irreparable shards that reflected every hidden transaction and unspoken slight. My revenge peaked wittily in the chaos, pulling from the binder a custom family ledger, a ledger of sorts, with tallied debts, not in dollars but moments. Tommy's lost milestones like his first bike ride against Maria's gains, such as the down payment party they'd thrown, presented as a mock balance sheet complete with humorous footnotes like interest accrued in broken promises. That had a few bitter laughs amid the uproar, satisfying in its sharp irony without descending to outright cruelty, making them confront the imbalance they'd nurtured over decades while I stood there, the architect of this clever takedown that forced nods of uncomfortable acknowledgement even from Dad as he slumped in his chair. But as shouts overlapped and chairs scraped back against the grass, a deeper parental secret unraveled, Dad admitting in the fray, his voice cracking under the onslaught, that the favoritism stemmed from guilt over Mom's early affair before they married, Maria as the legitimate anchor they'd clung to while viewing my birth as a complication they'd compensated for by making me independent, the confession complicating the blame like a plot twist in one of those family dramas on weekend TV, leaving dilemmas hanging like smoke from the dying grill. Was it all calculated cruelty, or flawed humans repeating cycles born from their own regrets? With Mom nodding tearfully that the forged letter was her desperate bid to protect the family image, without realizing it doomed Tommy? The eruption peaked with Mom's plea for forgiveness, tears streaming as she clutched my hand across the table, begging to make amends starting with checks for therapy or whatever I needed. But I pulled away gently, the ambiguity settling in like dusk over the backyard, where shadows lengthened and conversations fractured into small groups, some siding with me in hushed support while others defended the parents' intentions, the whole scene reeking of unresolved tension more acrid than charred hot dogs left too long on the fire. As the crowd dispersed into hushed clusters, exchanging numbers and nods that felt tentative at best, Maria approaching me one last time with a watery apology that carried the weight of her complicity, but also a glimmer of sisterly bridge-building. I walked to my car alone, the binder lighter in my lap now that its contents had spilled into the open, pondering the unanswered echoes. What bridges could rebuild on such rubble, and would the cost of this truth echo louder than the loss it avenged? Or had I just traded one form of isolation for another where family gatherings became minefields forever? The drive home blurred with the setting sun casting long shadows on the highway, the radio switching to a song about letting go that felt too on the nose, leaving the weight of it all suspended, a question mark in the rearview as questions lingered about Dad's hinted, big news, perhaps a will revision or health scare, that might force another reckoning. The breaking point reached, but the pieces scattered in ways that invited more uncertainty than closure, making me wonder if vengeance ever truly balanced the scales or just tipped them into a new kind of chaos.